So this is yet another English language A-level video, and we're doing one about language and gender. This is the third one in a series of videos about language and gender. In the first one, we looked at folk linguistics and Lakoff's deficit model. In the last one, we were looking at the dominance approach and the difference model. And in this one, we're going to call it a fourth D. We're going to call it diversity. The idea that men and women use language in very different ways is one of the great myths of our time. So speaks Deborah Cameron, another Deborah, not to be confused with Deborah Cameron. She thinks that the claims that have been made during the 1990s, early 2000s about this big difference in genderlets is actually a myth. She's skeptical about it, and that skepticism comes through in the title of her 2008 book, The Myth of Mars and Venus. Do men and women really speak different languages? So you've got the adverbial there, really, which denotes skepticism. Okay, there is an excellent chapter written in the English and Media Centre book Language, in which Deborah Cameron kind of takes us through the whole history of language and gender research. I've just taken some quotations from it. The more evidence researchers gathered, the harder it became to maintain the idea that some core set of linguistic practices continually distinguished male from female language users. We've moved from the 1970s, where Robin Lakoff was making all sorts of grand statements that were based on no data whatsoever, towards an area that is very, very heavily researched, with lots of very close studies done. And actually, when you look at these close studies, Cameron is arguing it's actually very difficult to argue that male and female language is very different or have predictable differences between them. Cameron would want us to differentiate between sex on the one hand and gender on the other, and she argues sex is a matter of chromosomes and reproductive organs, which do not vary across cultures and through time, whereas gender is obviously a matter of social roles and identities, and of course gender is far more flexible, so it's culturally specific. And what Cameron is arguing is that in reality, gender doesn't exist or influence behaviour in isolation, but actually what gender does, it interacts with those other sociolinguist aspects which you've been studying about, like ethnicity and age and class. So she's not saying that gender doesn't matter, but she says gender matters, but in combination with other sociolinguistic variables. And she talks about gendered performances. That idea of performance is going to be important. They vary considerably in different communities. And she draws attention to the hundreds of different studies that have been conducted. There have been studies of the language used by, for example, African-American drag queens, white college fraternity brothers, female footballers, male rugby players, high school girls in Bolton, male and female managers in New Zealand, nerd girls in California, phone sex workers, women MPs on the British House of Commons. So a whole wealth of different gendered study where actually it's not just gender that you're looking at a particular discourse community that's got links in with age and class and other sociolinguistic variables. And what Cameron argues is that actually speakers can choose to perform identity in different or unexpected ways. They're not simply pre-programmed to do the same thing in the same way forever. So this is a direct challenge to the difference model, with its confident claim that you can differentiate clearly in the language of males and females. Okay, and so Cameron puts emphasis on individual differences amongst men and women, not just between men and women, but amongst men and women. And she focuses really on the people within groups and how they use language. And she's viewing gender as certainly an important element of identity, but just one amongst many. And she also views gender not as a fixed identity, but actually gender is something that is socially constructed. Okay, so her work links in nicely with that of Judith Butler, who in 1990 comes along with a book called Gender Trouble. And Judith Butler coins the abstract noun performativity. Okay, and so Judith Butler is arguing that we're constantly constructing gender. Notice that verb, constructing gender. Gender is something that we do. We have agency on it. It's not what we are, it's what we do. And so she views language as being performative, good word to use. Our language constructs our gender rather than reflects it. There's a really good video here. It's on YouTube. Judith Butler, Your Behaviour Creates Your Gender, 3 minutes long, very worth your while watching. And indeed, we have other researchers who are challenging some of the previous models. We have Janet Hyde. So Janet Hyde is an American psychologist, and actually she proposed a gender similarities hypothesis. And she claimed that in fact there are substantially more similarities than there are differences between male and female language. And what she's arguing is that where there are differences, that may be due to a number of the variables such as age, class, ethnicity, education, occupation, sexuality, and politics, etc. There's a quotation from Janet Hyde. The mass media proclaim that men and women are very different from each other, as if they're from different planets, Mars and Venus. I use the statistical technique of meta-analysis to analyse data on gender differences. Many of these differences turn out to be very small or non-existent, which provides evidence for the gender similarities hypothesis. Okay, so if you've got your AQA textbook, you might want to go to page 179 and have a look at a transcript that they've put in there between some college students talking with each other, a mixed gendered conversation. The question to ask is, are there any examples of spoken language features which support any of these gender theories? You know, your 4Ds that you're armed with now, your deficit and dominance, and what's the third one? Difference and diversity. You're armed with those, so you would be able to apply them to see whether actually in practice, with a tiny little bit of data, whether you've got any supporting evidence. So in this sort of conversation, are there any features which support and challenge the theories? And all the time you need to be thinking, well, what are the influences on language besides gender? Here we've got the first bit of a conversation between Kirsty and Tom. Kirsty says, and he tries really hard, and I think that's sweet, and I really like him. I can't stand people who can't be asked, otherwise known as a chav. Yeah, but they blame other students. Well, no, then again, yeah, Helen, your argument doesn't fit, because if you look at my family, and John, Michael, and Andrew all dropped out of education, but I'm still trying. No. So here are the sorts of things that if you were looking at gender, you might want to be thinking about. It was Lakoff who came up with this idea of empty adjectives. She was saying that in the 1970s, female talk is laced with these kind of powerless, empty adjectives. And I suppose she might call something like sweet there being used as a post-modifying adjective as one of these empty adjectives. I think a linguist would fight against the idea of an empty adjective. A linguist would say that there's no particular lexis which is empty. All language has meaning. Even the vaguest sort of filler has a kind of meaning within conversation. So maybe Lakoff would describe Kirsty's comment there as particular to females, in the sense that it's kind of like a vague sense of approval that she's giving with that word sweet. Remember, in the deficit model, Lakoff was also claiming that females tend to use much politer forms of language. But actually what we've got here is Kirsty using a mild taboo language when she uses the idiomatic expression people who can't be asked. So that seems to challenge that deficit model. Think of the dominance model. The dominance model is arguing that males tend to dominate conversations. So what you need to look at is the topic management there, like who's deciding upon the topic. And you need to look at the mean length utterance, the MLU. Mean length utterance is the average number of words spoken per turn. And you can, of course, do that statistically. Count up the number of words that Tom says in this exchange, and then divide it by the number of turns that he has. and then you've got the average number of words. Here, there doesn't seem to be a very big difference between Kirsty and Tom. I know that Tom says quite a bit in that penultimate bit, but overall, the MLU is pretty balanced. So that would kind of challenge some of these dominant ideas. So you see what you're doing here, you're sort of noticing bits and pieces in the transcript and trying to think, well, is this supportive or is this challenging any of the D's that we've been talking about? Okay, and you could do this with some real life conversations. I say real life, this is reality TV. Quite whether you'd interpret that as being real life is another thing. So this is from The Apprentice. So there's a nice little video here which I can show you, which is called Paula, You're Fired. And it's from The Apprentice. It's in the boardroom in The Apprentice. And if we just play this, just a little bit of it, maybe I can show you the transcript and get you started on some kind of gender analysis of what's going on.
Paula, I heard you mention that you're a human resource manager, so you shouldn't be responsible. You don't do numbers, and you don't do this, and you don't do that. Is that right?
I didn't say that, Sir Alan. I said
what was the point you were making as a human resources manager?
Because you've got a person here who works in finance and a person who runs a restaurant.
You're the team leader. You're the team leader.
I understand that, but my skills are in creativity and.
Well, you know how to work out redundancy on a calculator, don't you?
Okay, so we've got a very distinctive kind of discourse here, and the question is, well, can you apply gender theory to such a distinctive, special kind of discourse here? So if you were in my group, I'd get you to be annotating the transcript of this. Look, if you're analysing any kind of male-female interaction or any gendered analysis going on in a transcript, you'd be looking at the following sorts of things. So the number of turns taken, what I've just said about MLU, and the length of turns. And clearly you'd be wanting to look at interruptions as well, because clearly there you've got a bit of talk where there is a lot of interrupting going on, and it is Alan Sugar who's doing the interrupting. So is that an aspect of gender, or is that just a broader aspect about power? So look at the number and type of interruptions. And of course, remember the work done by Zimmerman and West on that, where they went around those Californian campuses in the 1970s, and they came up with that startling statistic that in mixed gender conversations, 96% of the interruptions were done by males. So is the evidence that plonked in front of you kind of confirming that? You could look at hedging, because hedging is all about using more indirect language. So is there evidence here that males or females are using more indirect forms of language? And remember about the claims made by Tannen about the essential difference between males and females is that females tend to use language to be more cooperative and males use language to be more competitive. Tag questions are always worth looking at. I mean, linguists are absolutely obsessed with these things. It was Robin Lakoff in the 1970s who said that, well, females tend to use more tag questions. And she interpreted that as an index of powerlessness, but because they were using tag questions, it meant that they were almost asking permission from their listeners. Whereas other researchers have come along, people like Pamela Fishman, and said, well, it may well be that females are using more tag questions, but it's not necessarily all about their powerlessness. In fact, you can use tag questions to be quite intimidating and aggressive, can't you? Okay, so tag questions are certainly worth looking at and what the speakers are trying to achieve by them. Look at the extent to which we've got positive face. Positive face, remember, means to what extent you're being complimentary and praising the other person. Whereas negative face doesn't mean being negative. Negative face meaning standing back and using respectful language, often formalized language, in order to give the other person options. And you're never very far away on a transcript from Grice's maxims, because if you're sensing that somehow the conversation is breaking down somehow, at that point, then you can apply Paul Grice's conversational maxims, where he says, well, if it is breaking down, it may well be that you've got violation going on of quantity or quality or manner or relevance. And other things to look at in terms of gender. So to what extent are these participants using standard or non-standard language? Remember again the claims made by Lakoff that women tend to use more standard forms, which seem to be backed up by Trudgill's research done in the 1970s in Norwich. Look at the sentence functions, like who is doing stating, who is asking questions, who is exclaiming, who is giving commands. So look at the sentence functions. Quite interesting to look at terms of address. I mean, in this particular one, of course, you've got the whole aspect of the use of the honorific term Sir Alan, for example. So terms of address means the way that people name each other. And then you've got modal auxiliary verbs, which on the one hand can be high force, like deontic, you must, you should, you will, and they can be epistemic, which is low force, like may, could, etc. And another final thing to look at when you're looking at any kind of transcript is to look at the pronoun usage as well, because have you got lots of I, me, and my, as somebody speaking entirely from their own perspective, first person singular pronouns, or maybe they're using the collective inclusive first person plural pronouns like we, us, or our, or it may well be that they're using language in a very direct way with lots of second person pronouns, you. These are all the key areas to be looking at any transcript when you're analysing gender and any other socio-linguistic factors that are going on. And that's crucial, that last point, that whenever you're thinking about gender, I mean, Cameron's point is that you've got to look at it linked in with those other socio-linguistic and contextual factors. So here we've got Sir Alan saying, what was the point you was making as a human resources manager then? And then Paula's saying, because you got a person here who works in finance and a person who runs a restaurant. Okay, so here, what was the point you were making? Is this evidence of a dominance approach? Certainly you've got the male participant here controlling the conversation, and he's doing that through interrogatives in adjacency exchanges. Have you got evidence of Tannen's difference model? Here the male participant using very sort of direct confrontational language and using the second person pronoun to address the listener. And then finally, on Paula's response, you've got perhaps evidence that challenges the deficit theory, because here, remember, Lakoff is saying, well, females tend to use more standardized forms in public life. Well, here we've got ellipsis, because we've got the missing out of the primary auxiliary verb have, and we've got elision as well. So we haven't got evidence of these super polite or hyper-correct forms that Lakoff claims females tend to use. Okay, so if you were in my class, I'd be getting you to be annotating, thinking about the transcript, and then I'd be getting you to be doing a piece of writing with reference to the apprentice data, evaluate the idea that women and men use language differently. Okay, so whenever you do this kind of topic, make sure that you hone in on very specific linguistic detail. But also remember to be tentative in your conclusions, which means don't make big, bold claims on very limited evidence. Okay, so use modality where words like perhaps or maybe or epistemic modal auxiliary verbs, that will keep your conclusions tentative. And always bear in mind that yes, you're looking at gender, but you need to be referencing other contextual and socio-linguistic factors here. So in this particular one, it's the notion that actually you've got a lot of observer's paradox going on. So these are not casual conversations going on between people. These are people who are having a conversation, but in front of the cameras with all the lights and the sound crew there. So it's very much a conversation as performance. Okay, there's a number of nice videos out on the net there. There's a girl there who's done a set of English language A-level videos. This one on language and gender is quite a nice one. There's another one there done by another A-level teacher. And in our next video, that is what we're going to be going on to evaluate the idea that English language suffers from a gender bias, which needs addressing. Thank you very much.